They found him on his throne, naked and covered in blood. His heart burst open in his chest. It was the night of the king's feast. Our village had gathered outside the palace, filling the air with music, clapping, and the scent of roasting meat. People were laughing, dancing, letting loose. But when I looked up at the palace, something felt wrong. The torches flickered strangely, casting shadows that stretched and twisted. The doors stood slightly ajar, just enough for me to glimpse into the main hall. I wasn't supposed to be there. My father was a guard for the palace, and I'd sneaked out with him, hoping to catch a glimpse of the king's court. The king had been known for years for his unusual appetites, they said, especially with women. People whispered about it but never dared speak openly. He was the king, after all. Who would stop him? As I peered through the cracked door, I saw the women he had summoned that night. They were young, too young. Some of them looked terrified, huddling together like sheep. His guards forced them forward, and I saw the look in his eyes, hungry, wild. He grinned as he beckoned them closer, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the hall. Outside, the drummers kept beating, louder and faster, like they were pushing the crowd into a trance. The villagers danced and clapped, unaware of what was happening just a few steps away. But inside the hall, the laughter was fading, replaced by the sound of pleading and soft cries. His hands, pale and twitching, reached for them one by one. Then, as the drums outside picked up speed, the screaming began. People say he lost his mind that night. The king's hunger turned into something else, something darker. He moved from one woman to another, frantic, like a man possessed. They say he was cursed, that a witch from a distant village had set this curse upon him for what he'd done to her daughter years ago. She'd been a healer who warned that one day his own desires would consume him and that he'd die by his own cravings. The drums outside kept beating, but inside I heard something else. It was a heavy, rhythmic thump, deep, uneven, growing faster and faster, like the heartbeat of a beast. It wasn't coming from the drums, though. I realized it was coming from him, from the king himself. Then, silence suddenly. The palace doors burst open. The drumming stopped, the dancing stopped. People gasped and scrambled as the guards carried out one of the women, limp, eyes wide, her face frozen in horror. She was alive, barely breathing, but her eyes were blank, as if she'd left her mind somewhere dark. They tried calling for my father, and when he didn't come, I was pulled inside with the others. There he was, the king on his throne, naked, slumped over, his hand gripping his chest. Blood pooled around him, his face twisted into a ghastly smile. His heart, it had burst open, leaving a gaping wound, as if something inside him had clawed its way out. They say he died because his body couldn't hold his own desire, that his greed finally ripped him apart from within. They ordered everyone out, but I couldn't stop looking at him. His eyes were still open, staring blankly, his mouth twisted like he'd been laughing or screaming when it happened. His hands were clutched so tightly his nails dug into his own skin, deep red marks on his palms. The women were taken away, silent, their faces drained of color. Some say it was the witch's curse, others say it was his own doing. But I remember his face frozen in that twisted smile, like he'd gone somewhere dark and hadn't come back. And they say if you're out late, near the palace grounds, you can still hear the drums beating, echoing from that night.